This presentation is titled Home Was a Horse Stall, a story about Japanese internment camps. Japanese internment camps, an outcome of intolerance. As Asians arrived to the United States, they were met with intolerance. Acts, laws, and orders were written in order to keep people of color from success. The racism was not made obvious in what was written until 1942. In 1942, anyone of Japanese descent were put into internment camps based on FDR's Executive Order 9066 in February and the Civilian Exclusion Order number 27 in May. Internment camps were referred to as relocation centers and were found in these cities: Tule Lake, California; Minidoka, Idaho; Manzanar, California; Topaz, Utah; Jerome, Arkansas; Heart Mountain, Wyoming; Poston, Arizona; Grenada, Colorado; and Rower, Arkansas. Home Was a Horse Stall. An excerpt from Us and Them follows the story of Suyako, Socks, Kitashima, and her family, the Kataokas. Socks' immigrant mother and father owned a restaurant which fell apart in the earthquake of April 1906. They then moved on to tenant farming. Her father wanted to own a farm of his own, but in 1913 a new law denied ownership to anyone who was not eligible for citizenship, and the Naturalization Law of 1790 permitted eligibility to only white immigrants. This was not the first sign of racism towards people of color, or more specifically towards Asians. There was racial tension and intolerance since the 1849 gold rush. Even with the racism being the norm, the Kataokas met Mrs. Perkins, who showed them kindness. They rented and worked on her farm as well as cared for her big ranch house. World War II was raging rampant in Europe. In December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, which then fueled the racial resentment towards Japan, to then become wrongfully justified incarceration of anyone of Japanese descent. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued the Executive Order 9066, which prompted for all Japanese people, whether alien or non-alien, to be excluded from the West Coast. The Kataokas and roughly 112,000 other Japanese lives were disrupted. Orders posted on telephone poles in public buildings declared that Japanese Americans had 1 week to prepare to leave their homes. May 9th of 1942 was the day of forced departure. Again, Mrs. Perkins showed the Kataokas kindness. She gracefully hosted breakfast with the best of the best for a family who had to give up everything before dropping them off to the Japanese school for pickup. From the Japanese school, they rode a bus to Tanforan Racetrack in San Bruno, California. They had their suitcases ransacked and were shown to their living quarters. A ceilingless 9 by 20 feet horse stall with manure smeared and littering the dirt floor. They slept on makeshift mattresses made from cloth sacks and hay. By the end of summer, they moved inland to Topaz, Utah. Their new quarters were still not the best, but better, and the Kataokas were satisfied at the moment. The change in lifestyle became clear after a few months in the camps. Socks began to notice that Japanese customs were being forgotten and people were becoming aimless after losing their self-respect. Camp residents had to pull together to avert despair, which was difficult because they were reminded everywhere they looked of their status, because they were surrounded by barbed wire, police patrols, curfews, and armed guards atop watchtowers. People were killed for merely going near the fence. On November 22, 1944, President Roosevelt lifted the Civilian Exclusion Order, and a month later, the concentration camps were announced to be closed within a year. After 3 years and 4 months, Socks and many others were allowed to go home. Those who went back to their homes found that there was nothing left. Socks' mother, Yumi, had nothing to go back to after her children had all moved away from her. She joined a group headed to Richmond, California. As for Socks, she and her new husband, Tom Kitashima, moved to San Francisco.
Timeline of Japanese Americans. 1790. The naturalization law made it so that no person of color can become an American citizen. 1848. Gold was discovered in California, and many of the workers who were used for going into the mines were non white. 1853. Commodore Matthew Perry, who is also best known for his war against Mexico and winning it, forcibly opens up Japan to the Western trade. 1868. The first Japanese immigrants came to Hawaii to work on the sugar cane plantations. 1873. Those of African descent become eligible for citizenship, but not if you are of Asian descent. 1882. The Chinese Exclusion Act exclude all Asian immigrants. 1908. The gentleman's agreement between Japan and the United States stops laborers from coming from Japan. 1913, the Alien Land Laws said that aliens are ineligible to own land, primarily if you are an Asian male. 1924, Johnson-Reed Act halts immigration of Japanese into the United States. October and November 1941, the Munson Report concludes that Japanese are loyal and not a threat to the United States. December 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. February 1942, Executive Order 9066 allows military authorities to exclude anyone, anywhere to trial or hearings. May 1942, the Civilian Exclusion Order orders Japanese American citizens to be forced into camps, and their possessions were all taken. 4 Japanese Americans challenged the constitutionality of the Civilian Exclusion Order and refused to comply with the exclusion orders. They were Fred Korematsu, Mitsuye Endo, Gordon Hirabayashi, and Minoru Yasui. 1943. The Army issues a loyalty questionnaire in the camps and creates tension. 1943 to 1945. The All Japanese American 100 Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team will become the most decorated units of their size in the U.S. military history. Japanese Americans served in the Army during this time, even though they were considered to be traitors to the United States. 1944 to 1946. Camps run by the War Relocation Authority closed, leaving Japanese Americans with $25 and a one-way ticket, and the fear rejoining society as anti-Japanese sentiment was still rampant. 1952. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 allowed Japanese immigration to the United States once again. 1970s. The Red Dress Movement, Japanese American communities demanded an apology and recognition of wrongdoings from the United States government. In 1981, CWRIC held public legislative hearings in its investigation into the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, with approximately 750 testimonies. On August 1988, President Ronald Reagan signs the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which provides for individual payments of $20,000 to each surviving internee and a $1.5 billion educational fund. 1990. First red dress payments are made, accompanied by a letter of apology signed by the President George W. Bush. Japanese Americans were forcibly being removed from their homes all over the United States. I specifically will explain about Japanese Americans in the San Francisco Bay Area. It is important to note that although I'm using Japanese Americans, it's important to understand that these were American citizens. Their rights were stripped due to hysteria and a lot of the propaganda that was going on at the time. In early 1942, then President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Order 9066, which excluded all people who had Japanese ancestry. So it did not matter that you were born in the United States. But as long as you had a Japanese last name, you will be considered a traitor to the United States. We must also consider that your rights to have a fair trial for something that you've been accused of being, you will have no rights to anything. So immediately you will be stripped of your rights. Looking at newspapers of the time at the San Francisco Museum.org, we can see how General DeWitt came up with newspaper propaganda, which allowed Americans to believe that Japanese were actually spies, which obviously was not truth. These newspaper articles spanned from January 4, 1942 to August of 1945, even after the war had already ended. Japanese Americans in San Francisco were transferred to many assembly centers. They call it assembly centers, which were actually internment camps. For example, there was the Japanese Americans of San Francisco Bay Area were transferred to the assembly center located in San Bruno, California. The occupation at this particular camp was 171 days, holding Japanese mainly from the San Francisco Bay Area. 64% of the incarcerated were American citizens. San Francisco Japantown on Pine Street. Japanese Americans are sitting, waiting to be relocated to internment camps, only taking with them what they could carry. Everything else will be sold off or kept by other people. All in all, Japanese Americans lost all of their belongings. Once they were let go of the camps, they had nothing to come back to.
Here are some examples of the inhumane conditions of the internment camps. Prior to the evacuations, the FBI searched private homes of thousands of Japanese Americans on the West Coast and even took items they deemed unlawful. Families were forced to sell or abandon their legally purchased homes, belongings, and businesses, and had a single week to leave what they couldn't carry behind with them. All internees had to wear tags with numbers to identify them. Camp locations were purposely chosen for their remoteness, and many were in the middle of the desert. Many living spaces of the camps were old and uninsulated horse stables or barracks that housed multiple families. As a result, diseases spread very easily due to the unsanitary conditions of the living quarters, and food poisoning was also very common. Eating areas, bathrooms, and laundry rooms were shared areas with limited running and/or hot water. Schooling for children was available, but Americanization classes were a part of the curriculum to ensure loyalty. All the camps were surrounded by barbed wire fences and towers with guards who were instructed to shoot anyone trying to escape. Some internees were even shot and killed for walking just closely to the fence. These are a few photographs depicting the conditions of the camp. On the upper left, we have a picture of a family with their tags. On the upper right is a picture of crowded mealtime in one of the shared cafeteria settings. And on the bottom is a sample of the room arrangement. Here are a few more visual samples of the conditions of the camps, in addition to signage, graffiti, a newspaper, and propaganda containing anti-Japanese sentiment. You can see that the camps were stripped and barren, offering very little for the internees outside of the barracks and stables they lived in. The "I am an American too" sign was written by Frank Tanaka and placed in front of his restaurant, which struggled after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Even prior to Executive Order 9066, Japanese Americans experienced much racism just by appearing to look like the enemy. This is a selection of some powerful literary sources about the internment camps. Baseball Saved Us and Fish for Jimmy are children's books that may be good additions to a young child's library.
This is the end of our presentation. Thank you. Arigatou gozaimasu.